I'm happy to announce that March 1st is the official release date of the new Thinking Aloud magazine's first quarterly issue. You can download free PDF copies from the website of the new Thinking Aloud Foundation. If you like a high-quality printed edition as a collectible, you can order it from magcloud.com.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we'll be looking at table levitation. With me is Professor Stephen Braude, who is an expert in macro psychokinesis, which is what we believe table levitation to be. I believe that. In any case, Stephen is the author of many books on parapsychology, including The Limits of Influence, a book about psychokinesis and the philosophy of science. He is also the author of Immortal Remains, a book examining the evidence for life after death. His other titles include Crimes of Reason, The Gold Leaf Lady, and ESP and Psychokinesis, as well as a book on multiple personality disorder called Person Plural. Stephen is the former chair of the philosophy department at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. Welcome, Stephen.
Thank you, Jeff. Good to be here.
It's a pleasure to be with you. And table levitation is a fascinating topic because there are, hundreds of reports.
Yes, and they seem to center and begin really in earnest around the heyday of the spiritualist movement in the middle of the 19th century.
It would make sense because in those days people sat in their Victorian parlors with big, heavy wooden tables, and they're all sitting around the tables, so attempting to induce spiritualistic phenomenon. And table levitations they would seem like a natural thing to occur in that setting.
Well, I think it was a natural thing to occur in that setting. It was not only a form of entertainment in those days, it was what seemed like, to many, a reasonable way of initiating communication with the dead. Mm-hmm. It was only later that people began to suspect that what might really be going on was that humans were psychokinetically causing the table to move.
Yeah. And of course, I think it's fair to say that table levitation affords many talented fraudsters an opportunity to commit fraud.
Of course, as with any macro-PK phenomena, they need to be produced under the right kinds of conditions to be convincing and compelling.
So we'll be reviewing this history, but I think it's useful for our viewers to appreciate that your interest in parapsychology was stimulated by a personal experience of table levitation.
Yes, this is what corrupted me. It was back in graduate school. In those days, I was fancied myself to be a kind of hard-nosed materialist. Not for any particularly good reason. It was just an intellectual conceit I was cultivating in those days. Mm-hmm. And one day, it was a slow day in Northampton, Massachusetts, and some friends stopped by and they said, let's play this game called Table Up. They didn't know anything about parapsychology, just as I didn't. And they said this was a lot of fun, and when it worked, it was really cool. And so it was my apartment, it was my place, it was broad daylight, it was my table. And for 3 hours I watched the table. It didn't fully levitate, but it tilted up dramatically under our fingers. We could be standing next to the table and the table would rise under our fingers. No legs were pushing it up, no people were pulling it up. Mm-hmm. I doubt that there's any way I could describe this that would make it completely compelling to skeptics, but I can say my friends were not practical jokers, not even sure they had a sense of humor. And if one of them left to go to the other room, the table still would tilt under our fingers, not in the direction that you would have expected if it had been manipulated physically by one of us. So I didn't know what to make of it at the time. It just scared the hell out of me, and I put it out of mind until I got tenure.
You found it frightening?
Yes, because I didn't know what it was.
And do your friends find it frightening?
No.
They thought it was just a game.
Yeah, that's how they...
Well, there's another game that people often play, I was reading about recently, Light as a Feather, where people try to lift another person.
I've done that.
Uh-huh. And the suggestion is that sometimes that person appears to be light as a feather. And
yes, they seem weightless.
And so perhaps there's some psychokinesis involved in that game.
I don't want to rule it out. I mean, we don't really know, but... if so, then I would say it conforms to my own experience of full table levitations that I've had since these days back in graduate school.
You've made a point of researching this type of phenomenon in terms of case study research.
Well, I've wanted to study physical mediums of various kinds to see what they're up to. And in many of those cases, table levitations are part of the repertoire. And one medium I studied in Germany, Mügge, I wouldn't endorse all of his phenomena for reasons I've explored in various publications, but the table levitations I'm convinced are genuine, or at least many of them are. And some I have video recorded under infrared or under very low light with very sensitive cameras. But what strikes me about those is that when the table rises under our fingers, it feels weightless, it feels buoyant. And I can compare that to the way the table feels when people seated around the table try to lift the table and raise it, because then I'm aware of the force pushing the table up. When the table actually levitates, it doesn't feel pushed up, it feels like it's floating.
In fact, sometimes people try to push it down and are unable to do so.
Yeah, we didn't have that experience, but that is an often reported experience among those who've witnessed table levitations. I can also tell you that with Kai, when I investigated him the last time in 2015, the table would be up for about 20 seconds, and it was swaying back and forth to the rhythm of the music that was playing at the time.
Well, it's interesting that you should mention music, because the table levitation phenomenon often occurs in a seance-like sociological setting. And those settings, going back to Victorian days in England and in America, they often included music and singing and a kind of party-like atmosphere.
Well, this was investigated considerably later in the 1970s and 80s by Ken Batcheldor. And what he concluded about his group sittings was, first of all, that it was very helpful to keep one's mind off the phenomenon itself, because then there was too much invested in success or failure. Better to distract people, keep their minds focused on other matters, keep the atmosphere light, tell jokes, maybe even to fraudulently initiate the phenomena to get people to believe in the reality of it ahead of time, so that that would stimulate the production of genuine phenomena.
To prime the pump, so to
Yes,
speak.
exactly right.
Yeah. Which would be an old shamanistic trick.
Yes. I think William James even reported once, I forget exactly what the story is, he simulated the beating of a frog's
Well, that was not priming the pump. That was an example where he admitted he committed fraud.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
Yeah.
Take that back.
He was giving a lecture on physiology, and he had a heart he was showing to his students that was supposed to be beating, as I recall, and it wasn't. So he took a straw or something and poked at it to make it appear as if it was beating when it wasn't.
I retract that example.
Yeah. It was, but he admitted it later on. He said, I committed academic fraud for the benefit of my students.
Right. But what Batcheldor found, and others I think have found similar things, that once you get people focused in the right way on what's going on, to get them to believe in the reality of the phenomena, what really matters is the belief in the possibility of the phenomena.
Right.
And sometimes priming the pump will do that.
And of course, we have all the sheep-goat literature that suggests that when people believe, they get better results.
Yes, and Batcheldor also noticed that sometimes natural sounds occurring while waiting for the table to rise, like thermal changes causing noises in the table, might get people to believe that, or just muscular movements, real muscular movements on the table, might get people to think that something psychokinetic is happening, and that might cause something genuinely psychokinetic to happen.
Well, along with table levitations, we often get table rapping, where you get communication of some sort going on.
Well, one case that gave examples of not only rapping, but table movements, dramatic table movements, was the Philip case in Toronto back in the 70s. This was a case of apparently PK by committee. Members of the Toronto Society for Psychical Research wanted to investigate the kind of phenomena reported in mediumistic circles. They invented a character named Philip. They gave him an elaborate history, concocted this dramatic story around his life. The people involved in this experiment really embraced the story. They absorbed it. They basked in it for some time. And then they tried to communicate with Philip and got ostensible communications from Philip, including rappings in the table and table movements corresponding to the rappings.
And they would ask questions, and the rappings on the table would be in response to their questions.
Not only that, but they would be in proper response to the amount of knowledge that the participants had about the story they'd concocted about Philip. So if the question they asked Philip didn't have a clear answer in the history that they'd concocted, they didn't get a clear answer in the table.
So that would be an example that suggests that this is not necessarily a spiritual or spiritualistic phenomenon, but that is not produced by external spiritual agencies, but by the people sitting at the table themselves.
Yes, I have to say for those survivalists watching that it doesn't rule out the possibility of spirit influence, but it certainly doesn't make the case for it either.
No, I suppose you could argue that, well, some other spirit came by and decided to impersonate Philip.
Yeah, but there's no independent support for that conjecture.
Of course,
right?
Yeah. And I think it's fair to let our viewers know that in your analysis of the spiritualistic literature in your book, Immortal Remains, you say that there's still a lot of weight to be given to the living agent psi interpretation of these phenomena.
Yeah, I mean, to this day, I'd say, at least on some days, I still regard it as a kind of toss-up whether we've got evidence for living agent psychokinesis or psychic functioning or evidence of survival. On some days, I think the scales tilt slightly in favor of survival, but it's a difficult case to make one way or the other. So
with table levitation, could go either way.
Well, except there's, in most cases of table levitation, there's no real evidence favoring psi. I mean, there's not really survival psi. I mean, there's not much evidence given in cases of table levitation. It's just dramatic.
And what you, if I understand you correctly, what you mean is independent evidence of accurate information obtained by the medium.
Correct. Yes.
That would suggest that there really was a discarnate entity in the room.
Right. There's very seldom evidence of that kind in cases of table levitation. It's just dramatic, and it's ostensibly produced by a spirit. Yeah.
And maybe in another 100 years of research, we'll have a better idea about that.
Who knows? The phenomenon, though, has been investigated very systematically by a number of people, and there's great documentary evidence of table levitations.
Hundreds of photographs.
Yes, wonderful photographs. And in many cases, these were done in exactly the right way. One case was by T. Glenn Hamilton in Canada in the early 20th century. One thing he did was to place a plaque, photoluminescent plaque on a table, so that when he charged it and the lights were turned out, you could see when the table was rising. And he had a bank of cameras focused on that part of the room. So when they knew the table was rising, he would trigger the cameras to go off. And there were some very dramatic shots he got of table levitations. And the best part is the expressions of the people who are being hit by the flying table.
I know, there you can see the shock on their faces.
Right.
Well, you've made a real study of the methodology used in the late 19th, early 20th century when so many of these cases were being observed. And as I recall, one of the conclusions that you've drawn is that the researchers involved, even though this was generally speaking in an era prior to the use of statistics and double-blind experiments, but they had very rigorous protocols nonetheless.
They did. One of the best was by Sven Turk in Scandinavia. He did everything the right way. Mm-hmm. He had massive tables. He had luminescent strips on the legs of the table. He had luminescent strips on the legs of the chairs seated around the table. He had luminescent strips on the foreheads of all the people seated around the table. Mm-hmm. So again, when they were charged and the lights were off, it was always clear where everybody was. And then when objects started to move, whether it was a chair or a table, he would trigger the cameras, and he got some very dramatic shots from multiple angles of large objects flying around the room. And again, the expressions of the participants are really the best part of the photos. Mm-hmm.
Well, skeptics, I suppose, are going to say, yeah, there must have been fraud somehow. Even parapsychologists, such as our good friend Ed May, says you can't rule out fraud in these early case studies.
You can't rule out fraud in any experiment, but I think the real question is whether the evidence of an honestly conducted experiment outweighs the evidence for fraud. And in these cases, it clearly does.
Well, and I know you've made a very careful analysis of that, but let's look at one feature. You mentioned the lights and the darkness of the room. Many mediums insist the room has to be dark in order for them to produce phenomena, but others, such as the famous D.D. Home, produce the same phenomena in broad daylight.
Well, Hume was an exception in that respect. It's clear that light doesn't necessarily inhibit the phenomena, but when you're dealing with ordinary people and not gifted mediums, I think Batcheldor had it right about this. Mm-hmm. What matters is belief, and what darkness does is to make a difference to the optics of the situation. Mm-hmm. So when you're bathed in darkness, you're not confronted with the kinds of physical evidence that might lead you to think, well, this couldn't possibly happen. Mm-hmm. In the dark, you could think, or more likely to think perhaps, that anything can happen. Mm-hmm. So it makes a difference to what you think is possible, and what you think is possible may be conducive to unusual things occurring.
Now, you've done some case studies of your own recently.
I've studied a guy in Argentina named Ariel Farias. Mm-hmm. Great thing about Ariel is that he doesn't require darkness. He's a regular guy. Again, like the best psychic subjects, he's not interested in being a psychic guru. Mm-hmm. He's a regular family man. He's got a good day job. He's just interested in understanding what's going on. He's opposed, as far as I can tell, to the spirit hypothesis of what's happening. But he found, to his surprise, that he's able to make tables rise by touching them lightly at the close end of the table. Mm-hmm. And we've got some very good video of the table rising under Ariel. Mm-hmm. What's also interesting is that the table legs and Ariel himself are placed on strain gauges so the changes in weight can be measured. And the table leg closest to Ariel is on a strain gauge. So even when the table hasn't yet levitated, Ariel can see from the strain gauge that the table is getting lighter. Mm. So he likes that kind of feedback. Mm-hmm. And that tells him that he's on the right track. He feels that when he puts his hand on the table, he feels as if his hand is merging with that of the table. Mm-hmm. And interestingly enough, his hands and forearms get quite cold when all this happens. And I should mention they're not sticky.
Yeah.
A recent report on Ariel's phenomena has been published in the Journal of Scientific Exploration.
Mm-hmm. Of which I should mention you were the editor.
Yes, it's not just a sleazy plug. It's an interesting paper.
Yeah, no, it's a wonderful journal.
Well, I accept that wholeheartedly. Thank you.
So the phenomenon that Ariel produces in Argentina, is it done in a kind of mediumistic setting?
It was originally. The folks at the Buenos Aires Institute for Parapsychology, Alejandro Parra's group, had organized a kind of spiritist sitter group modeled after the Bachelor sitter groups.
Yeah.
And they were getting some dramatic table movements, and which many of them interpreted spiritistically.
Now, Bachelor himself did not, as I understand it. He basically felt that the seances conveyed a psi-conducive condition
Correct.
that enabled the participants to exhibit psychokinesis.
Correct. But this so-called red light sitter group did think that, or many of the participants did favor, on the whole, the spirit hypothesis. Not Ariel, however. But they found out by a process of elimination that the table only rose when Ariel was seated at the table. And then they discovered that Ariel could do this on his own. So Ariel has very cooperatively spent several years just exploring his own ability to make the table go up. He hasn't gone much further with it. I should also mention that Ariel's connection with PK phenomena began early on in his early teens in some poltergeist-like incidents. Connected initially with the death of his father, but continuing later in life. So even today, when Ariel gets agitated, things will fly off shelves.
Interesting.
So he's got that connection with PK phenomena that some of the great psychics have too.
Well, it's interesting when we talk about table levitations. They initially occurred largely in the spiritualistic settings. People, by and large, thought it's either fraud or it's the work of the spirits. But these days, now we have so many other examples of spoon bending and other forms of parlor game psychokinesis. I mean, it's not uncommon for people to consider that they might actually have this ability themselves. It doesn't require a spirit, whereas at one time, I suppose the idea that a human being could perform psychokinesis, certainly back in the 19th century, was almost out of the question.
Right. It took a while for the idea that humans might be involved in this to gain a foothold. But now the only limiting factor, I think, is one's capacity to tolerate abuse from those who are skeptical.
Or abuse from those who are so wedded to the spiritistic hypothesis that they consider you an enemy.
Yeah, well, I have some of those, right.
I'm aware of that. And my own point of view, for the benefit of our viewers who might be curious, is that we just don't know enough yet.
Yes, I think that's fair.
We need to keep an open mind to various hypotheses at this point in the game.
Yes, I think our knowledge is still at a very early stage.
And my suspicion is that if we could pursue these studies intensively for enough time to really impact the culture, let's say several hundred years, it's likely that we're going to see more and more phenomena of this sort occur.
Well, not surprisingly, there's evidence that large-scale PK-like phenomena occur more readily in cultures where that type of phenomenon is not contrary to the prevailing belief system of the culture.
Or so frightening that people institute all sorts of mechanisms to suppress it.
Well, in some cultures it may be regarded as frightening, but people erect their own psychic defenses against it.
Well, sure. And I mean, the belief in black magic and witchcraft is pretty prevalent, but in Western culture, we burn those witches at the stake.
Right, and as we've discussed in the past, that's, I think, one of the main reasons for the intense resistance to the mere study of these kinds of large-scale PK events.
Yeah, I would say so. But table levitation is particularly intriguing.
It is. You can do it at home.
You can.
It doesn't require special equipment. I wouldn't recommend starting out with heavy tables, though, because, again, we are dealing with our primary source of resistance, which is our culturally inherited belief about what's possible and what's impossible. And we're more likely to think that PK could lift a lighter table than a heavy table.
Well, when you got together with your friends when you were a student in played the game. What did you call it?
Table up.
Table up. Was that a lightweight table?
It was a lightweight. It was a folding table that I
Sure.
had.
So that might be a perfectly good way for people to start.
Yeah, I wouldn't recommend starting with a heavy table.
And in fact, I can say from my own experience, I don't recommend that people cultivate PK at all.
Well, from your experience with Ted Owens, that makes sense.
Yeah, but I think anybody is susceptible to potentially misusing it. It's really an extraordinary ability, and there may be a good reason why it's largely been suppressed in the human population. I do recommend that people study it, that they are aware of what's possible and what has been observed, but I don't think it's necessarily a direction that we want to encourage people to cultivate.
Well, I'm inclined to think it's innocuous so long as we're doing it in the context of group sittings and making it into something like a party game, like Table Up. It's not quite the same as training people to be wizards where you can stop your fellow's heartbeat.
Yeah. Well, I suppose not, but my concern, for what it's worth, it's probably worth very little, is that if a person develops some real skill, like Ariel at table levitation, and someday he gets really mad at somebody, perhaps for perfectly good reason, he might allow that psychokinetic ability to manifest in a way he would later regret.
Yeah, it's hard to know. I don't know what the relationship is here between one's conscious application of psi and one's unconscious application.
Well, I did an interview recently, and I'll just mention it briefly, with a fellow named Lynn Buchanan, who deals exactly with that sort of thing. So for our viewers who want to dig a little deeper, that would be a good place to start. Or the interview I did with you earlier on poltergeist phenomena.
Oh, yes.
It can be quite disturbing at times. It's one of the reasons I think maybe it's people who want to cultivate psi abilities might wish to start elsewhere.
Well, but the genie's out of the bottle already. So.
Stephen Braude, once again, thank you so much for being with me.
Thank you, Jeff.
It's been a pleasure. And thank you for being with us.